We're on the line right now to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Dan Griffin. One of his books is called A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps. He talks about addictions and overcoming them, directing his message specifically at men. Dan, how are you?
Good morning, Bob. I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. I must say, it just seems to me, interviewing a lot of people in the field, that most self-help groups are geared toward women, right?
Actually, most are probably geared for men and women, but they don't necessarily speak to men's or women's unique experience in the context of how we're raised, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, because talking about this concept, and when you first said it, I thought, oh, yeah, he's got a point. You know, usually when I have the self-help authors on, often they are women. And it seems to me they are maybe speaking more to women, which we're happy to do. We have a large female audience here. But I was thinking, if we're saying that a men's, approaching addiction in men is sort of not like mainstream, it dawned on me before we started the interview that the founders of AA were two men, Bill and Dr. Bob, right? So I mean,
absolutely, they were.
So there. And I think typically in the 12-step programs, was it not true? I mean, in the early days, it was mainly men that would go to these things.
Absolutely it was. Absolutely. And so the distinction that I bring is, when Bill and Bob wrote the big book, or even when the treatment model was developed, it didn't necessarily say to men, this is how you've been raised all your lives, and we're asking you to do this in order to get into recovery. And as you said, this in many ways is geared more toward women because it's about what? Talking about your feelings, letting go of control, being vulnerable, engaging in your relationships, asking for help. Those are not things men are raised to do, and yet we're expected to do it, learn how to do it in 28 days. And, of course, without learning how to do that, most of us will not find sobriety, and that's really the key.
Can you talk a bit more about, and I think you call it here, the man's perspective on getting sober?
Sure. That dichotomy that I just mentioned, it affects a lot more men than they realize, and I learned this by writing the book because I interviewed 40 men. And when I asked them how their lives had changed or how their ideas of being a man had changed since they got sober, many of them at first thought, well, I don't know that they have. But as we began to explore it, they thought, well, God, I didn't hug guys before I got into the program. I didn't talk about my feelings. And so a man's perspective is really men learning to find their authentic masculinity without it being driven or relegated to this is how a man's supposed to act, but more this is who I am, and so this is how I'm going to live my life. And at the same time, it's supporting men in being able to look deeper at some of those things that might get in the way of being able to do that.
It's interesting.
Such as feelings and shame and that sort of thing.
It's very, very interesting, and it is so, isn't it, that with so many of improvement programs, you do end up being a little touchy-feely. But I mean, it seemed to me there are some real human out there, and honestly, I wouldn't be one of them. I've been a hugger and all that kind of stuff. But for those for whom this is a big deal, can you still get sober and not have to hug somebody at an AA meeting?
You absolutely can. What I've been hearing about my book is that it's helping men to just see a broader perspective of sobriety. Men who aren't even sober yet are reading it and are saying, gosh, I never thought about that, or I didn't think anybody really understood my experience. So you don't have to become a hugger, but what you can understand is that if you're a man who has struggled with always feeling sensitive, then there's a majority of men in recovery who know what that's like, and you don't have to feel ashamed about it. And at the same time, it's about affirming what I think, and many think, is best about being a man. Integrity, responsibility, accountability, being of service to others.
Unfortunately, with booze and sometimes without booze, men can do some awful things. Women can too.
Yep.
But I think you confront that as well. I mean, this kind of bad reputation that men have in the world, or maybe you turn on Oprah, Dr. Phil, often it's the woman who's messing up, but quite often you've got the child pornographer, the man, you've got the abuser of a wife, the man, and so forth. So do men who are trying to get sober have to overcome that stuff as well?
Absolutely, and you hit the nail on the head when it comes to why did I write this book. I've been sober for almost 17 years. Next month it'll be. And I've watched, not only from my own experience, but so many men. They're losing marriages. They're ending up in anger management problems. They're having sex addictions because of their the use of porn. And yet we don't talk a lot about that in treatment at the beginning, and we don't talk a lot about it in the recovery meetings. So my book was really about saying, look, there's a lot of men's experience, a lot of the challenges that men are having that we're not directly confronting. Men's sexual abuse, men's abuse of others, but also men who grew up being abused. There's a very high correlation to boys who are abused to men who are abusers. And a lot of men end up doing that with no real understanding of what is happening, and without exploring it, it's really a very hard cycle to stop, and it causes a lot of damage. I mean, when men act out, it tends to have very big ripple effects, much bigger than a lot of the times when women do.
Mm. You approach this from having been there. I mean, you were addicted, and now you've said you're sober. Is there more to it? I mean, are you a trained counselor or anything like that?
I was trained at Hazelden as a CD counselor. Hazelden's a large treatment center in Minnesota, and in the recovery field is one of the best known and turned to. So I was trained as a CD counselor.
I'm sorry, what does CD mean?
I'm sorry. Yeah, a chemical dependency counselor, an addiction counselor.
Okay, right.
I've worked in that field of addiction and mental health for 16 years in a variety of capacities. And in fact, it's been my work that really urged me to write this book because, again, like you said, I saw a lot of special services, a lot of special attention for women, which is absolutely important and necessary, but very little for men. And so this model from 50 years ago was still being applied to men with very little change.
Dan Griffin's book is A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps. What would be your advice if you met your old self now, or what would be your advice to a drinking man, about what he or can expect in recovery?
I would say it's an amazing journey. It's not easy, and the greatest gift you can give to yourself is to not do it alone. Is to ask for help, is to accept help, and is to be of help.
It might have been the higher power that sent them to us. But I was out with my friend Audrey over the weekend. We went to a party, and we sat at a table with a bunch of guys. And we didn't know the guys would probably never see them again. But we kept talking about how we're sitting with the boys. It was like this surprise birthday party for somebody else. And it was interesting talking to them that they all supported each other. Like the guy sitting next to me goes, well, if it weren't for him, and he pointed to the guy across the table, I'd still be drinking. He was my buddy, got me to stop drinking. And so you're saying that is important.
I would say that's essential. There's nothing worse than trying to deal with an addiction on your own because it's such a self-centered experience and your perception is so distorted.
Well, good stuff in Dan Griffin's book, A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, also author of Helping Men Recover. Chemical-dependent counselor Dan Griffin is author of those books. I imagine they're available online. And do you have a website? Yes, you do. DanGriffin.com. Is that
That's right.
That's your website?
Yes, sir.
All right.
DanGriffin.com, and you can find me on Facebook, and I'm always interested to hear what people think of the book.
All right.
You can contact me through the website.
Well, Dan, I thank you very much for joining us today. Have a good day. Really sounds like a good message. Take care.
Thanks so much, Bob. I really appreciate it. You have a great day, too.
You too.